You're nothing but dead weight, and we don't need you anymore." The words cut deeper than any wound, not from strangers, but from the very blood meant to stand beside him. Imagine the betrayal. On a birthday meant to celebrate life, the people closest to him delivered not love, but eviction, stripping away the home, the business, the wealth, and the dignity he had built over a lifetime. What happens when the foundation of family turns into the sharpest blade of all? This is the story of how betrayal nearly destroyed everything, and how resilience turned the tide. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I was 62 years old when I finally began to see my life for what it truly was. For decades, I had been known in Austin, Texas, as the man who built Hayes Realty Group from a single rented office into a regional empire. My mansion on the west side of the city stood like a monument to my efforts, a Mediterranean-style home with tall archways, polished stone floors, and a garden that seemed to glow at sunset. People said I had everything a man could want: wealth, reputation, and family. Yet, beneath that picture of success, I often felt the quiet weight of loneliness pressing in. My wife, Laura, had passed away 10 years earlier, and since then the mansion had lost much of its warmth. Her photographs still lined the staircase, her favorite vase still stood on the mantle, but the laughter she brought into the house had long since faded. I raised our 2 sons alone, pouring myself into their futures. Daniel, my eldest, became a polished attorney, ambitious and sharp, while Mark, my younger son, gravitated toward the arts, opening a gallery that carried his name in gold letters. Outsiders often said I was lucky to have such accomplished sons, but I sometimes wondered how well I really knew them anymore. Each morning, I followed a routine that seemed to anchor me. I would brew a pot of strong coffee, step into the garden, and breathe in the scent of the old oak tree that shaded the property. That tree had been there since I bought the land, and I had once promised Laura that we would watch our children grow beneath its branches. Now I stood there alone, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. The silence often reminded me how quickly years slipped by. Business remained my pride. Even after Daniel had taken over many responsibilities at the firm, I still reviewed the daily reports. I liked to see the numbers lined up, the contracts signed, the properties sold. Daniel insisted I should relax more, enjoy retirement, but I wasn't ready to let go of the company that had shaped my identity. My name was on every building we developed, every deal we closed, and I couldn't imagine a day without running through the details myself. Mark's gallery was another matter. He loved the parties, the champagne openings, the artists whose work he claimed would change the conversation. I supported him financially, hoping he would find his footing, though I noticed his expenses always seemed larger than his sales. I told myself he was young and needed time to mature. Still, there were evenings when he came home late, his clothes smelling faintly of cigar smoke and whiskey, and I wondered whether he had inherited more of my stubborn streak than my discipline. There were subtle changes that unsettled me. A few important papers in my study no longer sat exactly where I left them. I once found the safe unlocked, though I was certain I had secured it. Daniel often took calls in hushed tones, ending them quickly if I entered the room. He would smile and change the subject, assuring me he was handling some minor client issue. Mark, meanwhile, had begun to make sudden purchases for his gallery, expensive frames, large shipments of wine for receptions, marketing campaigns that seemed extravagant. When I asked him how he paid for it, he brushed me off with a laugh and said, "Don't worry, Dad, it's all covered." I wanted to believe them. They were my sons, my blood. A man who has built towers and filled neighborhoods with new homes can still be blind when it comes to his family. I told myself the oddities were nothing more than my imagination. Perhaps age was making me suspicious. Perhaps I was simply overthinking the natural independence of grown children. After all, hadn't I always wanted them to be strong, confident, and capable of managing their own lives? At night, the mansion was quiet in a way that sometimes unnerved me. I would sit in the leather armchair by the lamp Laura had chosen, a book in hand, though my eyes often wandered to the window. From there, I could see the city skyline, its lights flickering like a promise and a warning. The mansion's wide halls echoed with nothing but my footsteps, and though the house was filled with expensive furnishings and carefully curated art, it often felt like a hollow stage set after the actors had gone home. I knew something was shifting, though I couldn't quite name it. Success had brought me wealth and reputation, but it had also built walls between me and the very people I loved most. My sons spoke to me politely but distantly, as if I were a shareholder rather than their father. The company thrived, but I sometimes felt like a guest in my own boardroom. The mansion shone, but the warmth inside had dimmed long ago. That evening, as the Texas sun sank behind the horizon, I stood by the tall window of my study, coffee cup in hand. The light painted the garden in deep orange and gold, casting long shadows across the grass. For a fleeting moment, I imagined Laura standing beside me, her hand on my shoulder, reminding me that appearances can deceive, and that family bonds must be nurtured, not assumed. A faint unease settled in my chest, like the first chill before a storm. I didn't know it then, but the shadows stretching across my lawn were only the beginning of something far darker that would soon swallow everything I thought was mine. If you're still watching and wondering how an ordinary birthday could turn into the moment a father lost everything, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. It was a week before my 63rd birthday, and the mansion carried a strange stillness that I couldn't quite shake. Everything appeared the same: polished marble floors, soft lamps casting their golden glow, the faint hum of the air conditioner. But the atmosphere felt heavier, as though the house itself sensed what I had yet to see clearly. That evening, I walked down the long hall toward my study, intending to retrieve a file I had left behind. The door was ajar, light spilling into the corridor in a thin line. I slowed my pace when I heard voices inside. My sons were talking, their tones lowered but urgent. I held my breath and leaned closer, careful not to let the floor creak. Daniel's voice carried first, calm but cold. "Dad isn't as sharp as he used to be. We need to legitimize control before it's too late." My heart lurched. He wasn't talking about the company in general terms. He was talking about me. Mark responded, his words edged with impatience. "The power of attorney and the new will. Once he signs, we won't have to worry anymore. We just need him to believe it's something routine." I felt the blood drain from my face. They were plotting not only to strip me of authority, but to do it in such a way that I wouldn't realize until it was too late. I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles whitening, as their conversation unfolded like a cruel play written behind my back. Daniel continued, his lawyer's cadence precise. "We'll present it on his birthday. He'll be distracted, expecting a celebration. It'll feel like a family gesture, not a legal ambush." I stepped back slowly, afraid they might hear the pounding of my heart. In that moment, the mansion I had once built as a fortress for my family became a stage for betrayal. I thought of Laura, my late wife, and how she used to insist we eat dinner together no matter how busy life became. I imagined her voice whispering that money can twist even the closest bonds. As I retreated down the hallway, I noticed details I had overlooked. Daniel had been keeping thick folders close to him, never letting me glance inside. Mark's spending had grown reckless. Lavish gallery parties, high-end wine shipments, and art pieces of questionable value. Their excuses now echoed in my ears as rehearsed lines. Even at the company, subtle signals had been there. Employees I'd worked beside for decades avoided conversations about leadership. Some shuffled papers nervously when I entered the room, as if holding secrets they were told not to share. Daniel brushed off my concerns with smooth reassurances, saying everything was under control. Mark distracted me with invitations to his gallery openings, where the wine flowed freely and conversations were deliberately superficial. Back in my study later that night, I sat in silence, staring at the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. The 4 of us were smiling, Laura radiant, the boys leaning against me with carefree expressions. That photograph had been taken 20 years earlier, before ambition and greed had carved shadows into their faces. I recalled the times when my safe had been left open, though I knew I had locked it. Important property deeds once sat on my desk, only to vanish and reappear later in unusual places. At the time, I convinced myself it was my own forgetfulness. Now those memories came rushing back as clear evidence of a deeper scheme. The study, once a place of order and accomplishment, felt suddenly foreign. The shelves of real estate books, the maps of Austin developments, even the polished desk, all seemed to mock me with the illusion of stability. My sons were planning to erase me from the very legacy I had sacrificed decades to build. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, my hands trembling slightly as I sat in the leather chair Laura had chosen years ago. I stared into the amber liquid, my reflection distorted in its surface. Could my own children truly see me as an obstacle? I whispered under my breath, the sound swallowed by the quiet room. I thought of Daniel's careful plotting, of Mark's eager compliance. They were not acting in haste. This betrayal had been brewing for months, maybe longer. Their voices replayed in my head, every word cutting deeper. Power of attorney, new will, legitimacy, birthday. They were preparing to celebrate my life by dismantling it. That night, sleep did not come easily. I walked through the mansion's dim hallways, my footsteps echoing like reminders of what I had created and what I might soon lose. I paused at Laura's photograph once more, her smile frozen in time, and wondered what she would have said if she had been alive to witness this unraveling. A sense of dread settled deep in my chest, heavier than any burden I had carried in business. Deals could be salvaged, fortunes rebuilt, but betrayal by blood was something far more devastating. I clenched my fist, staring at the flickering light from the fireplace, and made a silent vow. I would not allow myself to be erased quietly. The sun rose the next morning over Austin, painting the sky with pale streaks of pink and gold. From the window, the city looked vibrant and promising, but to me it felt like a fragile facade. I had built towers and homes for countless families, but in my own house, the foundation was cracking. As I sipped my coffee, the bitter taste lingered longer than usual. Deep inside, I knew the coming week would change everything. The day of my 63rd birthday arrived with all the trappings of celebration. The mansion was alive with light, the grand chandeliers sparkling above the marble floors, and laughter spilling from the garden, where guests mingled under the canopy of string lights. From the outside, it looked like the perfect gathering, one that any man would be proud of. Yet, from the moment I stepped into the crowded foyer, I felt something was amiss. Daniel and Mark wore smiles that seemed rehearsed, their eyes darting to each other more often than to me. I could feel their anticipation, though I couldn't yet see the trap they had set. Friends and colleagues greeted me warmly, clinking glasses of champagne, telling me I looked younger than my years. I shook hands, exchanged polite words, and offered my thanks. But beneath the noise, I sensed a hush surrounding my sons, as though they carried a secret too heavy for the occasion. Their gestures, their whispers, and even the way they moved through the room betrayed a shared agenda. I knew enough to brace myself. It happened just as the music swelled and the servers brought out the cake. Daniel approached me with his lawyer's calm, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Dad, can we talk privately for a moment?" His voice was soft but firm, leaving no room for refusal. Mark followed close behind, carrying a thick folder tucked under his arm. I excused myself from the guests, though I noticed the sideways glances as I left. They led me into the study at the end of the hall. The room had been arranged not as a place of conversation, but as a courtroom. A heavy oak table stood in the center with a single chair placed deliberately across from them. The folder Mark carried was opened, and one by one Daniel laid the documents across the polished wood. His movements were precise, as if rehearsed. "The first," Daniel said, his voice steady, "is the transfer of Hayes Realty Group to my name. The second grants me full financial authority through power of attorney. And the third transfers ownership of this mansion to Mark." I stared at the papers, my breath caught in my throat. Each sheet bore highlighted lines and yellow tabs, marking where my signature was expected. The documents were not proposals or drafts. They were finalized contracts, waiting only for my name to make them binding. Mark leaned in, his expression unflinching. "Breathe easy, Dad. This is just to make sure you're taken care of. You won't have to worry about a thing." Daniel added, "It's for your protection. You're not as sharp as you used to be, and these measures will secure the family's legacy." Their words stung more than I expected. They were stripping me of everything: my company, my home, my independence, while masking it as concern for my well-being. It was betrayal dressed in legal jargon, cruelty delivered with a smile. I felt a swell of anger, an urge to stand and hurl the documents into the fireplace. But something inside me shifted. Rage would give them the reaction they wanted, the proof that I was unstable. Instead, I forced my hands to steady and picked up the pen Daniel had placed beside the folder. I signed the first document with a flourish, the ink cutting into the paper like a scar. Then the second and the third, my signature neat and deliberate. I watched their faces as I moved from page to page. Mark's smug smile widened. Daniel's eyes gleamed with triumph. They thought they had won. But as I wrote my name, I memorized every clause, every phrase, every loophole Daniel had buried in his arrogance. My years in real estate had trained me to read contracts like maps, and I saw the cracks in their carefully laid plan. What they saw as my surrender was in fact my quiet declaration of war. The silence in the room after the final signature was deafening. Daniel gathered the papers quickly, as though afraid I might change my mind. Mark clapped me on the shoulder with false cheer. I rose from the chair slowly, my expression calm, even pleasant. Out in the hall, I could still hear the laughter and music from the garden. Guests had no idea that within these walls, a man had been stripped of his empire by his own blood. I stepped back into the party, champagne glass in hand, and lifted it to my lips. No one noticed the tremor in my hand or the storm behind my smile. I walked to the balcony, letting the night air wash over me. The city stretched out in the distance, its lights glittering like 1,000 opportunities waiting to be seized. My sons believed they had buried me beneath their schemes, but they had underestimated the man who built this life from nothing. I had lost my company and my home on my birthday, but what they didn't realize was that I still had my will and my mind. As I stood there, the noise of the party behind me, I made a silent vow. They had drawn first blood, but I would have the last word. The night of my 63rd birthday ended not with celebration, but with a long, solitary drive through the streets of Austin. The mansion I had called home for decades shimmered behind me, its glowing windows now nothing more than a mirage in the rearview mirror. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I tried to process what had just happened. My sons had taken everything from me in the span of a few signatures. Yet beneath the sting of betrayal, a strange calm settled in. I had been stripped bare, yes, but that also meant I had nothing left to lose. I didn't go back to the small condo I sometimes used as a retreat. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot of a modest hotel off the highway, paid in cash, and asked for a room facing the back lot. The clerk didn't bother to look up from his computer screen, and I was grateful for his indifference. In that anonymity, I felt a sliver of safety. I carried nothing but a small suitcase, my wallet, and the weight of everything I had just lost. Inside the room, the smell of disinfectant and stale air clung to the furniture. I sat at the small desk by the window and pulled out the leather-bound notebook I always carried. Slowly, carefully, I began to write down everything I remembered from the documents Daniel had laid out before me. My training in real estate had taught me to never skim, and while I had appeared compliant in signing, my mind had memorized the details. I wrote furiously, noting every clause, every line that hinted at coercion, and every section where Daniel's arrogance left cracks. At dawn, I picked up the phone and called Evelyn Carter. Evelyn had once been a fierce competitor in the real estate world before moving into family law. She was sharp, battle-hardened, and one of the few people I still trusted. She answered with the same brisk tone I remembered. I explained in vague terms, careful not to reveal too much over the line. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "Richard, if what you're saying is true, they've built a trap around you. There are loopholes, but without evidence, it's your word against theirs." Evidence. That word rang like a bell in my mind. I needed more than suspicion and scribbled notes. I needed proof strong enough to stand in a courtroom and undeniable enough to shatter the lies my sons had spun. My next call was to George Miller. George had worked at Hayes Realty until Daniel fired him 2 years earlier over what Daniel called financial inefficiency. In reality, George had uncovered small irregularities that Daniel wanted buried. George had always been loyal to me, and though I hadn't spoken to him since his dismissal, I knew I could count on his sense of justice. When he heard my voice, there was a long pause before he spoke. I knew something like this was coming. Daniel's too slick for his own good. If you want my help, I'm in. But be careful. He's already covered his tracks. Encouraged but unsettled, I drove to the Hayes Realty office the next morning. The glass building gleamed in the sun, the name Hayes still etched proudly across the front. It was supposed to be mine, my legacy, but as I walked through the doors, the receptionist avoided my eyes. When I asked to see the latest reports, she stammered before saying she couldn't let me in without Daniel's approval. Security, she explained, had orders not to grant me access. I tried to use my old login credentials on the office computer, but the system denied me instantly. Passwords had been changed. Even the email domain rejected me. I was locked out of the very empire I had built, a ghost in my own company. A few employees passed by in the hallway, offering polite nods but nothing more. Their faces held discomfort, as though they had been told I was no longer to be trusted. I walked back out to the parking lot with a hollow ache in my chest. The message was clear. Daniel had tightened every lock, sealed every door, and painted me as irrelevant. For the first time in my career, I was standing on the outside of my own creation. Back at the hotel, I sat by the window as the neon lights of the diner across the street flickered on. The notebook lay open in front of me, pages filling with strategies, questions, and names of people who might still be loyal. My pen dug into the paper as I wrote, "This isn't over." The loneliness pressed against me, but within that silence I felt a surge of clarity. My sons had calculated my downfall with precision, but they underestimated the man who had survived recessions, cutthroat deals, and the grind of building an empire from nothing. They thought they had cornered me, but they had only awakened the part of me that thrived on challenge. I closed the notebook, my resolve solidifying. They had made the first move. Now, it was my turn to prepare for war. 3 days after I was shut out of Hayes Realty, I sat in a rented office on the outskirts of Austin, staring at stacks of papers scattered across a table. The blinds rattled against the window frame whenever a gust of wind hit, filling the room with a restless sound. Evelyn Carter sat across from me, tapping her pen on a legal pad. George Miller leaned over the table, his glasses slipping down his nose as he sifted through records he had pulled from storage. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. George cleared his throat and pushed a file toward me. I've been following the trail Daniel left. He thought he was clever, setting up shell corporations in Delaware. The money didn't stay there long. It moved through a network of accounts, ending up overseas. Millions, Richard. He's been siphoning off company funds for years. The words landed like blows. I had suspected betrayal, but I hadn't realized the scale. My son, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders through half-built houses, had become the architect of theft that could ruin us all. George wasn't finished. He opened another folder, his voice grim. Mark isn't innocent in this either. He leveraged the mansion as collateral for a private loan from a hedge fund, a risky one. If the payments stop, they'll foreclose. Your home could be gone within months. I clenched my fists, my pulse pounding in my ears. They weren't just taking control. They were dismantling everything I had worked for, tearing it apart brick by brick. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes sharp. There's more. We examined the documents you signed at the birthday party. The notarization stamps, they're forgeries. If we can prove that, the whole transfer collapses. And if we prove intent, it's not just civil, it's criminal. I stared at the papers, the yellow highlights where Daniel had insisted I sign. I remembered the smug confidence in his voice, the way Mark's hand pressed my shoulder as if to reassure me. My own children had conspired not only to strip me of power, but to frame it as my willing surrender. George set down yet another folder. His voice grew heavier. You need to see this, Richard. Mark's gallery isn't just bleeding money, it's a front for selling forgeries. Worse, the financial records list you as the primary patron. On paper, you're funding an art fraud and money laundering scheme. The room spun around me, my name, my reputation, everything I had built, smeared in ink across fraudulent ledgers. If federal investigators saw those records, I would not be seen as a victim, but as an accomplice. Before I could gather my thoughts, George's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and answered. His face paled as he listened. When he hung up, his hands shook slightly. There was a fire at Hayes Realty headquarters. Small, but it gutted the server room. The data backups, gone. Someone made sure the flames started right where the servers were housed. I felt the weight of it like a crushing stone. Not only were my sons stealing and lying, but now they were destroying evidence. Every safeguard, every trail that might expose them, they were burning away. Literally. I left the office with Evelyn and George trailing behind me. When we arrived at the scene, the air still smelled of smoke. Firefighters stood by the charred remains of what had been the nerve center of my company. Blackened walls and melted wires testified to the precision of the sabotage. It wasn't an accident, it was an execution. I stood at the edge of the wreckage, the flames still glowing faintly in the twisted steel. Memories flooded me. The first day I opened Hayes Realty, Laura by my side, Daniel as a boy running through the office halls, Mark drawing pictures on spare sheets of drafting paper. All of it had led here: betrayal, theft, and fire. Evelyn placed a hand on my arm. You need to understand something. They've crossed the line. They aren't just taking what's yours. They're dragging you down with them. But that also means they've made mistakes we can use. Her words steadied me. The anger coursing through me no longer felt wild. It was sharpened, like steel tempered by flame. If my sons and their allies thought I would crumble, they were wrong. I had built Hayes Realty from nothing once, and I could build a case against them the same way, layer by layer, brick by brick. I stepped closer to the wreckage, the heat brushing against my skin. In the flickering glow, I felt something shift inside me. Grief gave way to resolve, and despair hardened into determination. They've declared war, I muttered under my breath. But the ending will be mine to write. As I turned away from the burning shell of my company's heart, I knew this was no longer about survival. It was about justice. And for the first time in days, I felt a spark of power returning to my veins. The night after the fire, I sat alone in my hotel room, staring through the streaked glass at the city lights. Sleep refused to come, every flicker of neon reminding me of what had been taken. My company's servers had been reduced to twisted metal and smoke. The office where I had built my empire was now cordoned off with yellow tape. For the first time in my life, I felt like a man drifting without anchor. On the desk beside me lay a photograph of Laura, taken in the early years when the business was still a gamble and our future uncertain. Her smile was steady, her eyes clear, as if she believed no obstacle could defeat us. I could almost hear her voice. Your wealth isn't who you are, Richard. Your name, your honor, that's what lasts. The thought struck deep, forcing me to ask whether I was about to let my son steal even that. By dawn, the pressure from outside grew heavier. An email from Daniel arrived first, its tone sharp and calculated. Dad, don't fight this. You signed willingly. If you make trouble, we'll bury you in court. Hours later, a voicemail from Mark. You agreed to this. It's all legal. Don't embarrass yourself by pretending otherwise. Even the corporate attorney, now clearly under Daniel's influence, sent a formal notice stating that I no longer had any rights within Hayes Realty Group. Their message was unified: surrender, vanish, accept defeat. Then came the cruelest blow. A call from the bank confirmed my personal accounts had been frozen. Using falsified documents, Daniel had extended his control beyond the company and the mansion, reaching into my private savings. I was left with the cash in my wallet and the dwindling bills tucked in the hotel nightstand. For a man who had once overseen millions, the humiliation of having nothing was almost unbearable. I sat on the bed, the air thick with despair. My mind wavered between two paths. One was simple: disappear quietly, live out my days in obscurity, and let the Hayes name crumble into a cautionary tale of greed. The other was harder, filled with risk and public scrutiny. Fight back with Evelyn and George at my side, expose the lies, and reclaim not just assets, but the dignity that my sons had trampled. The second path terrified me. It meant going to war with my own blood. It meant risking what little I had left, perhaps even my freedom, if their schemes managed to frame me further. Yet as I wrestled with the decision, Laura's voice returned to me with clarity. A man can lose money and rebuild. But if he loses his honor, he's already lost everything. That evening, I met Evelyn and George at a small cafe that stayed open past midnight. The place smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions, its booths cracked from years of use. It was the kind of setting where desperate choices were made. We slid into a corner booth, papers spread between us like weapons on a battlefield. Evelyn's expression was firm. If you go forward, Richard, you need to understand what you're facing. Daniel will smear you as senile. Mark will say you were complicit in his gallery's dealings. They will fight like cornered wolves. But if we can prove forgery and track the offshore accounts, we have a chance not only to restore your rights, but to put them where they belong, behind bars. George adjusted his glasses, his voice low. I can keep digging, but Daniel has already hired experts to wipe digital trails. It won't be easy. We'll need patience, and we'll need you to stay calm when they come at you with everything they've got. I stirred the coffee in front of me, watching the swirl of cream vanish into the dark liquid. The silence stretched long. 2 roads lay ahead, surrender or battle. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the weight of choice. Finally, I set the spoon down and looked at them both. I'll fight, I said, each word deliberate. Not just for me, but for Laura, for the life we built, for every worker who gave sweat and years to Hayes Realty. If I stay silent, I'm no longer the man she married. I'll fight, even if it costs me everything. Evelyn's eyes softened with approval, though her tone remained practical. Then we start immediately. We'll need to file injunctions, protect what little remains, and prepare for a long battle. Once we commit, there's no turning back. George nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. I'll track the money. If Daniel thinks his shell corporations are invisible, he's about to learn otherwise. I rose from the booth, my resolve firming with each breath. Outside, the city lights no longer looked mocking, but alive with possibility. My sons had lit the fuse, but I would decide where the fire ended. For the first time since that cursed birthday, I felt the weight in my chest shift into something stronger than despair. Purpose. The choice had been made. I would not vanish quietly. I would fight. A week passed after I chose to fight, and the world around Hayes Realty began to tremble. News of the office fire spread through Austin's business district, like smoke drifting through a crowded room. Whispers turned to headlines, and headlines turned into questions no one at the company seemed ready to answer. Clients who had once trusted the Hayes name began calling, their voices sharp with concern. The empire I had spent decades building now stood on the edge of collapse, not because of me, but because of the recklessness of my own blood. Each day brought a new wave of calls to my hotel phone. Longtime partners asked if the company was still solvent, if Daniel was fit to lead, if their projects would be safe. I could hear the hesitation in their voices, the tremor of doubt that threatened to unravel contracts worth millions. Daniel's response was predictable. He went to the press, claiming I was delusional, a bitter old man inventing conspiracies to mask his decline. Mark repeated the story in social circles, painting me as paranoid and unstable. Yet the more they pushed the narrative, the more desperate it sounded. The pressure wasn't limited to business. One morning, 2 federal investigators knocked on my hotel door. They escorted me to their downtown office, where they laid out documents tying my name to financial transactions, funneled through Mark's gallery. According to the paperwork, I had been the primary sponsor of acquisitions that turned out to be forgeries. The weight of the accusation pressed on me like a stone. Evelyn sat beside me, calm but alert. She reminded the investigators that my signature could be forged and that the gallery had operated without my knowledge. Her presence kept the conversation from spiraling into disaster, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. That night, I returned to the hotel exhausted, replaying every question in my head. My reputation, the one thing I had thought untouchable, was being dragged through the mud. Yet beneath the fear, I recognized something else. Cracks forming in Daniel and Mark's carefully constructed walls. Their need to silence me so completely revealed how fragile their scheme truly was. The first crack appeared in Daniel's world. A financial reporter uncovered his ties to a hedge fund notorious for predatory loans. The revelation spread quickly, shaking the confidence of several investors. Long-standing clients began withdrawing, demanding reassurances he could not give. Daniel's anger spilled over in public interviews, his polished lawyer's mask slipping as he blamed me for his misfortune. To those who knew him well, his desperation was obvious. Mark's downfall followed swiftly. During a private showing at his gallery, an art collector exposed one of his prized canvases as a forgery. The humiliation was immediate and brutal. Word spread among Austin's elite that Mark Hayes was peddling counterfeits. Lawsuits loomed, and the gallery's reputation collapsed overnight. The same friends who once toasted him with champagne now avoided his calls. Still, the danger to me was real. I lived with the constant fear that one misstep could land me behind bars for crimes I hadn't committed. It was during a late-night review of copies of the birthday documents that I found something damning. Evelyn had secured duplicates from a sympathetic clerk. As I examined the pages, my eye caught a subtle detail. Daniel's handwriting disguised as mine on a land deal worth millions. My sons had not only tricked me into signing away assets, they had signed for me entirely in some cases. I showed the discovery to Evelyn and George the next morning. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she studied the forgery. If we prove this, it changes everything. This isn't just fraud. It's a criminal offense. Daniel could face prison. George nodded grimly, already calculating how to trace the deal back to Daniel's shell company. For the first time since that cursed birthday, I felt the tide shifting. The weight of betrayal still sat heavy on my chest. But now I had a weapon, proof that my sons had crossed lines they couldn't explain away. The days remained brutal. My accounts were frozen. My life reduced to the confines of a modest hotel room. Meals were simple, my resources scarce. Yet each time I glanced at my notebook, now filled with evidence, strategies, and dates, I felt a surge of strength. My sons had underestimated me. They thought stripping me of wealth and comfort would leave me broken. Instead, they had created a man with nothing to lose and everything to expose. One evening, as I sat by the window, I turned on the news. Cameras showed Daniel storming out of a courthouse, reporters shouting questions about the hedge fund scandal. Another clip captured Mark leaving his gallery, his once confident stride replaced by a slouch of shame. Their empire was cracking, piece by piece. I closed the curtains, leaning back in the chair, my chest tight with both exhaustion and resolve. "They've started to pay," I whispered to myself. "And this is only the beginning." The forged signature on the land deal sat in front of me like a loaded weapon. For days I had carried nothing but anger and despair, but now I had something tangible, proof that Daniel had crossed a line even his arrogance couldn't defend. As I traced the ink strokes with my finger, I felt the weight shift. I was no longer a man stripped bare. I was a man holding a blade. The first person I called was Evelyn. She arrived at the rented office with her usual stack of folders and an energy that always cut through my fatigue. George followed, carrying a laptop under one arm and a pile of receipts under the other. We spread everything across the table: contracts, photographs, forensic notes, my notebook filled with careful scribbles. The room looked like a war room, and in many ways it was. Evelyn studied the land contract with the forged signature, her brow furrowed. "This isn't just sloppy. It's criminal. If we present this to the district attorney, Daniel could face charges immediately. But we need more than one smoking gun. We need a case so airtight they can't wriggle free." George nodded. "I've reached out to an IT forensic specialist. She's willing to attempt recovery from the office servers. Even though the fire destroyed most of the hardware, there may still be salvageable fragments. If we can pull anything linking the shell corporations back to Daniel, we'll have the financial trail we need." Their determination steadied me, but it wasn't until later that day that the real breakthrough arrived. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Hayes, I think I can help. Meet me tonight. Confidential. Against my better judgment, I agreed. At dusk, I walked into a quiet cafe on the east side of town, the kind of place where the hum of an old refrigerator drowned out private conversations. Carlos Ramirez sat in the corner booth. I hadn't seen him in months, not since he left Hayes Realty. His face was lined with worry, but when he slid a small USB drive across the table, his eyes held conviction. "I couldn't watch them do this to you," he said. "These are emails between Daniel and Mark. They planned everything, the birthday, the forged notarizations, even how they'd make you look senile. I copied them before I left. I knew one day they'd matter." My hands tightened around the drive. For weeks I had lived in shadows, doubting myself, wondering if I'd ever have the power to strike back. Now, Carlos had given me exactly what I needed, a glimpse inside their conspiracy. I thanked him quietly, promising to keep his name out of it for his safety. When I returned to the office, Evelyn plugged the drive into George's laptop. We scrolled through message after message. There it was in black and white. Daniel outlining how he'd frame me as incompetent, Mark gloating about turning the mansion into his gallery showpiece, both of them mocking the father they'd plotted to erase. We sat in silence, the gravity of it pressing down. Finally, Evelyn leaned back and spoke. "This changes everything. These emails show premeditation. Combine that with the forgery and the financial records, and we have a case that not only restores your rights, but dismantles them completely." Meanwhile, the outside world was beginning to close in on my sons. The press had caught scent of Daniel's hedge fund dealings. Reporters hounded him outside courtrooms, peppering him with questions he couldn't answer without slipping. Mark's gallery, already wobbling under the forgery scandal, had its license suspended pending investigation. For the first time, they weren't the predators, they were the hunted. Yet, I knew the fight was far from over. Daniel was clever, Mark resourceful in his own shallow way. They would double down, fight with every dollar and every connection. And once I made my move, there would be no turning back. I stood before the corkboard we had set up against the wall. Documents pinned in place, red strings connecting Daniel's corporations to Mark's gallery, emails taped in neat rows, photographs from the fire, and now the forged signature highlighted in bold. It looked like a spider web, every strand leading back to the two men who shared my name. For a long moment, I simply stared. The life I had built, the family I thought I knew, the legacy I once believed unshakable, all of it had become a battlefield. But instead of despair, I felt clarity. They thought my silence would bury me. They didn't realize silence had kept me alive, had bought me time to gather the weapons I needed. I whispered to the empty room, my voice steady. They wanted me erased. Now they'll hear me louder than ever. The path forward was dangerous, but for the first time since my birthday, it was mine to choose. The Monday sun rose over Austin with an unusual stillness, as if the city itself were holding its breath. I stood outside the courthouse steps with Evelyn and George beside me, the weight of a thick leather briefcase in my hand. Inside were the weapons we had spent weeks gathering, forged contracts, emails, financial trails, and the USB that Carlos had risked everything to deliver. For years, my name had built Hayes Realty. Today, my name would reclaim it. We filed into the district attorney's office just after 9. The staff greeted Evelyn with respect, and I felt their curious eyes on me, the man they had read about in the headlines. At the conference table, we laid out our case. Document by document, George explained how Daniel had siphoned millions through Delaware shell companies. Evelyn presented the forged notarizations and my falsified signature on the land deal. Finally, the emails between Daniel and Mark revealed their cruel precision in plotting my downfall. The district attorney leaned back, his expression tight. "This isn't just fraud," he said. "This is conspiracy, forgery, and potentially racketeering. We'll move on this immediately." His words struck with the weight of a gavel. Justice was no longer a distant possibility. It had become motion. But we didn't stop there. While the DA prepared his team, Evelyn made a separate call. A trusted investigative journalist, known for dismantling corporate corruption, received a carefully selected package of evidence. By noon, her story was live online, headlined in bold letters. Hayes Realty Empire Built on Lies. Inside the family betrayal. Within hours, the piece exploded across social media, dragging Daniel and Mark into a storm of scrutiny they couldn't contain. The dominoes fell quickly. Banks froze Daniel's offshore accounts before he could move another cent. The hedge fund he had courted issued a statement distancing themselves, claiming they had been misled. Mark's gallery, already under investigation for selling forgeries, was raided by police. I watched the news footage in stunned silence. Mark in handcuffs, his once carefully styled hair disheveled, tears streaking his face as officers led him away. The twist came late that evening. George burst into our temporary office, laptop open, his face pale with both excitement and disgust. "You need to see this," he said, turning the screen toward me. It was an email from Daniel to a senior executive at the hedge fund, leaked anonymously. In it, Daniel bragged about his plan to seize Hayes Realty entirely, then flip it to an international conglomerate for a personal payout. He called it liberating the company from sentimental dead weight. For years, I had feared my son's betrayal on a personal level. Now, the world saw it for what it was. Not just a betrayal of me, but a betrayal of our community, our employees, even the country that had given us the chance to build. The outrage spread fast. Politicians condemned Daniel in press conferences. Clients severed ties overnight. Hayes Realty was no longer a dynasty. It was a scandal. The cameras captured the next blow. Live on television, federal agents stormed Hayes Realty headquarters. Employees fled the building, clutching boxes of personal belongings. Reporters swarmed the steps as Daniel was escorted out, his expensive suit crumpled, his eyes hollow. He tried to hide his face, but the cameras caught every second. The man who once carried himself with arrogance now looked small, broken, and cornered. I didn't feel triumph, only a deep, quiet ache. These were my sons, yet their greed had carried them here. Still, a part of me knew this was the only way the truth could rise. Later that night, alone in the office we had turned into a command center, I wrestled with one final choice. The law would do its work, but should I intervene? Should I try to soften the blow, to salvage some fragment of family from the wreckage? My heart tugged toward mercy, but Laura's words returned. A man's honor outlives his wealth. If I tried to protect them now, I would betray everything I stood for. So, I chose silence. No calls to lawyers, no favors pulled. I would let justice take its course. Daniel and Mark had set this fire. Now they would feel its heat. As dawn broke the next day, I walked past the shuttered Hayes Realty building. A red notice hung on the glass doors. Property seized, federal investigation. The empire was gone, but strangely I felt lighter. The chains of betrayal had been lifted, and in their place stood a man reborn. I whispered to myself, steady and sure. They chose this road. I only let the truth speak. When Hayes Realty finally collapsed under the weight of its own corruption, I felt an odd sense of relief. The empire I had once poured my life into was gone, but so too were the chains that had bound me to Daniel and Mark's ambitions. In its place stood something smaller, quieter, but infinitely more valuable: freedom. My days no longer revolved around board meetings or appeasing restless shareholders. Instead, they were filled with the rhythm of rebuilding, on my terms, in my way. I moved into a modest house on the edge of the city. It wasn't a mansion, but its walls were mine alone, paid for with clean money, free of schemes or betrayals. The morning light came through the kitchen window without carrying the weight of suspicion. I brewed coffee in silence, knowing no one was plotting against me in the next room. It was a simple life, but simplicity had become its own form of wealth. Work found me quickly. An old colleague introduced me to a construction firm that valued my decades of experience. They didn't see me as a relic or a liability, but as a man whose reputation, despite the storm, remained intact. I was given a desk, a team, and something I hadn't felt in years: respect. I didn't need ownership or a title carved into marble. I needed only to know that my work had meaning and that the people around me understood integrity still had a place in business. Yet even as I rebuilt, the shadows of betrayal lingered. At night, I would sometimes sit with Laura's photograph and wonder where I had gone wrong. How had the boys I raised learned greed more fluently than love? The answer came slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark horizon. Betrayal often blooms where entitlement grows unchecked. I had given them too much, shielded them from hardship, and mistook comfort for love. In doing so, I had blinded myself to the hunger that grew in their hearts. Still, the greatest loss wasn't the company or the mansion. It was the illusion of family. To know your own children conspired against you is a wound that no amount of money can heal. But it was also the wound that forced me to grow stronger. In losing them, I gained clarity. I finally understood that family is not defined by blood alone, but by loyalty, respect, and truth. Letters began to arrive months later. The first was from Mark, written in shaky handwriting. He asked for forgiveness, claimed he had been led astray by Daniel, promised he would change. Daniel's letter came weeks after, colder, more calculated, begging for a chance to hear my voice one last time. I read them both, then folded them neatly and placed them in a drawer. No reply, not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. Forgiveness may come in time, but trust was gone forever. Some lessons are best left to the silence of unanswered words. Through it all, one truth crystallized. Wealth is fleeting, reputation can be attacked, but honor endures if you protect it. When everything else is stripped away, it is the only currency that matters. My choice to fight was not just about reclaiming assets. It was about proving, to myself and to the world, that dignity has a voice, even when shouted down by betrayal. Now, when I stand at the window of my small home, the city spread before me. I feel no bitterness. I see sunlight instead of smoke, possibility instead of ruin. The betrayal that once crushed me has become the forge that remade me. In collapse, I found freedom. In betrayal, I found truth. And in loss, I found myself again. Those words are not just my lesson, they are my legacy. Life has a way of stripping away illusions until only truth remains. In the wake of betrayal, what is often lost first are not possessions or positions, but the sense of certainty we once carried about the people closest to us. Yet within that devastation lies a strange gift. It is in the collapse of false foundations that we discover what truly endures. Wealth, power, and influence may crumble in an instant, leaving behind only the ashes of what once seemed unshakable. But from those ashes rises something far greater than material success, the quiet strength of integrity. When everything external is taken, what remains is the unbreakable core of honor, dignity, and the will to rebuild. That is where real freedom begins. Betrayal is among the harshest of life's lessons. It pierces deeper than misfortune or loss because it comes from hands once trusted. And yet, in that piercing pain lies clarity. It teaches that trust should not be given blindly, that legacy is not measured by inheritance, and that survival is not enough if it costs the soul. Sometimes the truest victory comes not from vengeance, but from the refusal to be defined by those who sought to diminish us. The path forward is not about reclaiming what was taken, but about shaping something new, something born of resilience rather than entitlement, of truth rather than illusion. In this way, the end of one story becomes the beginning of another, richer not in wealth, but in wisdom. For in loss, we learn what cannot be stolen. And in silence, we often find the clearest voice of all, the one that calls us back to ourselves. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to? And how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.